Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for January 5th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined online by Jim Clausing. Welcome, Jim. And this is the first program of the new year. What's your New Year's resolution?
Well, my New Year's resolution is to automate the repetitive stuff, the routine stuff. I try to do this periodically, and I've noticed lately that there are some things I'm doing over and over and over again manually. So one of my New Year's resolutions is I'm going to write myself some scripts here early in the year to automate some of the routine stuff.
Now, I guess the real objective might be to not have to repeat anything, but given the fact that having to repeat things is inevitable, the security problems are going away. Yeah, that's a good plan. You know, it's important to think strategically about the activities we're doing, and try to free up some think time as opposed to doing mundane activities. So, good idea. Welcome, John Hogeboom, and what's your New Year's resolution?
I have two because I need a lot of improvement this year. But the first one is to improve our threat intelligence lifecycle and how we process threat intelligence, do it more quickly, get it actually into the systems that need it, and then get that feedback loop of what they detect, and if they detect new command and controls and things that we don't know about, kind of get that whole process working. And we've been working on that a long time, but I really want to focus in on that, at least for the first part of this year, and see how quickly I can get that going a little bit better than it is today. Good. And then my second one was to just kind of only write long emails when it really requires it. So to try to keep my emails a little bit more terse, unless it really warrants, a full analysis. Sometimes I'll spend a half hour to an hour with a full analysis, and that should go someplace else, like maybe a collaboration portal where we can go back and look at it later instead of it getting lost in an email somewhere. Yeah. So I want to try to be more smart about how I do my email work.
I agree. Good points. The obviously the threat intelligence, and we've talked about this before, that the attackers are getting more dynamic in terms of trying to make threat intelligence less usable. So automation around the threat intelligence is really necessary in order to make it more usable. And I think, their efforts with, DHS to try to get more automated feeds and to try to get it into a position where we can do some of those things. And then we need to do that more generally across our sharing networks. And so a lot of efforts, but you've been doing a lot of work on that type of activity as well. So to make sure that we're making good use of the platform that's been put together for that purpose makes a lot of sense. And your point about emails, one of the best ways to not get attention to your email is to make it too long to comprehend.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the problem. That's why I don't get a lot of responses. It's too long, didn't read.
Okay, well, we have Matt Kaiser here today. Welcome back, Matt. And what's your New Year's resolution?
I also have two. And they're sort of more personal than they are for the bigger scheme of AT&T. But one is to automate my backups. And most people won't think of that as a security resolution, but I think availability is important as well. So if I can't get to my files, I'm up the creek.
I'm just surprised you haven't done that already.
Well, that's the thing. I do it, but then I do it when I think about it. And I don't often think about it. So automating it, I think it'd be a much better.
Automation is being discussed here.
Oh, yeah.
In all of ours. Anyway.
Too darn busy. And the second one is to read one technical book a month, which I started off strong last year. I got to about May, and I found other things to do. But
well, I think I'm going to hold you to that. So as you come on to ThreatTraq,
do I have to do a book to read?
We'd like to hear about
a book report now?
Yeah, book report.
We have to do a book report.
Look like one-page double-spaced or single-spaced?
Just tell us about it.
500 words or more or less or whatever it is.
3 bullets. All right, and of course I'm Brian Rexroad, and I've basically resolved to devote more time to an effort, by the way, not just time, but toward our strategic planning. As a person that's responsible for the organization that's doing our threat analysis, I really think it's important that we have basically a documented plan that describes what our strategy is, not for this year necessarily, certainly for this year, but looking into the out years and anticipating what threats we might be seeing in the future, and making sure that we have activities in the direction to prepare for that. So that's my resolution. So all these are good resolutions, and so let's get back to more the here and now.
All right.
And voter databases, I guess there was an exposure.
Yeah, two databases actually. So there's a researcher named Chris Vickery. I believe he was poking around looking for insecure MongoDB databases that were connected to the internet. And it looks like he found two of them that both contained what I'd describe as, I guess, registered voter information. Now, one of them, it seems it was tied somehow, and it's not conclusive yet because the owners have not said this is our data. They've actually said this is not us. Related to some group called Nation Builder. Okay. But he shared this information with the owner of databreaches.net and with Steve Reagan, I think, of CSO Online. And they've looked at this data and they've come to the same conclusions. But it's personal information. Technically, a lot of it is public information, like your address. But there's other things that are being collected, things that are specific to your voting preferences that kind of get sensitive. And actually, I think at scale, when you have a lot of public information at scale, it becomes, and this is probably debatable, and I'd like to hear what you guys have to say, but it becomes a little more dangerous to have it all in one place. Because the idea of, if I can grab the list of everybody in the US who votes and use it, I don't know, send spam or target particular groups of voters for reasons that are, suspicious, whatever. I feel there's a concern there. So.
Oh, you're absolutely right. This is actually one of the classic issues, particularly in databases that are perhaps not holding classified information. And that, I'm speaking in terms of the context of the government where they have classified information. An individual thing like a pizza order at the Pentagon is not a classified piece of information. But if you have hundreds and hundreds of pizzas being ordered and you normally don't have that piece of information is an indicator that there's something going on. It doesn't necessarily tell you what's going on.
Wasn't there a story like, was it the invasion of Iraq or something, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
so
I remember that.
It dates back to that. So, but it's those types of things that in aggregate become significant. I think, it's right to be concerned about that sort of thing.
So that's the first one. That database is no longer online. So whoever's it was, and of course, Chris Vickery is not saying where he found this database or who it belongs to, which is probably for the best because
it could have been somebody already stolen it.
That's the thing. There's no indication of how long it was online. He found a second database. So the first one had about 191 million voter registration information. So that's kind of scary. The second one was another unsecured Mongo database. This one had several different lists in it, but 19 million profiles on voters with their private interests. And it seems this one is most likely connected to a group called United in Faith, who I believe shares information about churchgoers or something, it seems, and their interests, and whether or not they would be someone you might want to talk to as a pastor and say, I realize you're very strong in your religion, I know you're, and this is some examples, into hunting and fishing and going to church and things like that. I'd like to talk to you about how you're, whether or not you're voting. Because you might be able to say, based on these things that about this person, they would probably vote probably conservative.
In a particular, some way or another, yes.
Okay. Again, this database is no longer online, which is good as well. There were some interesting points made in the articles that the state laws governing voter information like this wildly vary. Some have no laws. Some have laws that say you can share it or you can't share it, or certain organizations can use it and others can't. So it was a pretty deep dive into exactly how this data gets treated and things that I really hadn't thought about myself.
I hadn't really thought about it either, so perhaps this will heat up the topic a little bit more and get a little more attention around it. Very good. One of the things I think you sort of stumbled across is that he found these databases apparently by scanning. Is that?
Well, that's the thing. He hasn't said how he found them. I think in order to prevent other people from finding them. My speculation is that you would use some sort of either existing scanning database like Shodan, or just looking for the common ports that Mongo uses, and then do what everybody who scans these sorts of things would do is try default credentials and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, the reason I wanted just to encourage folks that you're not, if you're exposed to the internet, you're getting scanned.
Yes.
There are public databases available. That information, you should go to use it and find out more about your systems, because the bad guys are doing it.
Absolutely.
So it's effectively an arms race in that regard. So
Yeah, while you've been
that
listening to this
follows.
program, you've probably been scanned at least by 1,000 probes.
That's a good possibility. Right. Okay, so John, let's go to you here, and I guess this is a different flavor of things. This is where people are starting to get a little more destructive. You know, before we get into this, I actually was a little bit surprised we didn't see any significant destructive malware events in 2015.
Right.
It is the last real significant one that at least that I think of, is the Sony Pictures event.
Right.
That was in November 2014. 2015 we kind of skirted by, and I think it was because we sort of predicted that, you know, destructive malware was going to be a big thing. I mean, the ransomware certainly was, but this looks like it's taken it to another level. Tell us.
Yeah, so this story, and there's still some loose holes because we haven't really gotten a full analysis of what's been reported here. But basically what happened is on December 23rd in the Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of customers of a regional power authority lost power. When they did some analysis of it, they realized, okay, there was some malware on these machines and they were intentionally disrupted and sabotaged. So the interesting thing, then some people started to, some of the researchers like ESET and ISET partners were doing some analysis, and they're trying to piece together some loose ends. So this is still a little speculative. However, they do have strong suspicion that the black energy malware was in play here. We've talked about black energy on the program before. It's a kind of a sourced from Russia piece of malware, mostly for backdoor crimeware or other types of espionage type of activities. They also noticed that it was recently updated because they're monitoring people using the black energy. So the toolkit itself had been updated with a kill disk function, which basically causes deletion of certain parts of the hard drive so that it won't be able to boot anymore. And then it also has some functions for sabotage specifically of industrial control systems, which is interesting. So you're kind of piecing it all together. Not to say that that is a nail in the coffin as to who is behind it, but it is pointing in that direction.
Suggestive,
right. There's also a new backdoor SSH backdoor that has been recently added to Black Energy. So other interesting thing is Black Energy is tied to the Sandworm gang, who's we've talked about on the show before with some other cases. I can't remember what the other case was that we had maybe last year or in 2014. But I think they've targeted like NATO, some other organizations. And they have strong ties to Russia. And
this was a pretty sophisticated group, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
There are a lot of groups that make lofty claims, and then there are others that actually do it.
Right. The other interesting thing is that according to ESET, that they have evidence that the Ukrainian power authorities in this case, where they got this black energy malware from, were infected using booby-trapped macro in Microsoft Word documents, which we've seen a lot of that going on, where you get an Excel or Word document, you open it up, and it says, in the document it'll say, enable macros up above with a little arrow pointing up there in order to see the whole content of this document. And people just, okay, and they click on it, and then boom, it runs the macro virus that dumps something down on the machine. We've been seeing a lot of other malware families using this technique as well. So not a surprising technique, however, maybe surprising that whoever is opening these documents got spearphished and is on the same machine that manages the power systems. So that's a little, you would think you'd want to separate that a little bit.
Yeah, it's possible, but they could have also pivoted. But I agree with you.
True,
you
that's
shouldn't
true.
Keep
They could have
that
pivoted
sort of
once they're inside.
critical
You're right.
stuff on a separate network segment.
Right.
Completely.
That's a good aspect. I have a good point, though. It could be that they pivoted once they were in. So anyway, an interesting turn of events. I missed the predictions episode for last year. My prediction, had I been able to make it, was that the interest in industrial control systems and SCADA is going to kind of escalate, and it was kind of based on the whole destabilization of the world in terms of we were kind of tight with a lot of other countries, and maybe a lot of countries are in it for themselves lately, it seems like. So I think there might be more renewed interest. I'm not saying that this was a nation state motivated thing. We know there's a lot of things with Russia and Ukraine that aren't quite cool.
Well, it appears to be politically motivated.
Yeah, probably. Suggestive of that.
Right. Okay, well, we'll see how this plays out and see if other events start to pop up. Okay. So Jim, let's go to you here, and I guess one of the things we'd like to try to do to avoid some of this, or at least perhaps the remote, access to databases, for example, would be passwordless authentication. I guess Google's trying something. Can you tell us a little more about it?
Yeah, this one got my attention right around Christmas. Apparently, Google has started a limited trial program with a small number of users to basically take passwords out of the authentication process. We talk about passwords all the time and the issues with them, and recommending two-factor authentication and all of that. What Google is trying to do with this trial, and whether or not they extend this beyond just a trial, remains to be seen. But essentially, what's going to happen with this is when you go to log in, you get the login screen. You type in your email address, and then instead of entering a password, it will send a something to your mobile device, your mobile phone or your tablet, and ask, are you really trying to log in on this other PC, yes or no? And if you say yes, then it'll go ahead and continue your login, and you can do whatever you want, with Gmail or whatever. So it's a little different from things that they've tried in the past. I use the Google Authenticator for two-factor authentication to a number of services that I use, but this one, you won't be actually typing in a password, which is one of the things that people have issues with. It'll just send this notification to another device that, in theory, you should have on your person, and you approve or disapprove. And if you approve, then you can continue. So for folks who never lose their phones, this might be a good option.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it's the ultimate solution to the authentication problem, because somebody gets their hands on your phone, they can still pretend to be you. There are still a number of issues with it, but we'll see how well it works. I think Yahoo actually did something similar back in October. They have an app you can put on your phone that behaves pretty much the same way. It sends, it launches the app and says, are you really trying to log in on this device? And you say yes or no, and then it goes or not.
So is this solution that Google's providing, is it exclusively an app-based solution? Is it specific to Android?
No, actually, it works on both Android and iOS. From what I've been reading, I have not actually seen it. I'm not part of the small group of users. I've just seen a lot of people reported it. I guess it first showed up on Reddit, and then a number of other folks picked up on it. There's actually a Google group that's public that you can see that the users are having conversation in this Google group on the issues they're seeing and so forth.
Okay, all right. Well, good. That's the one of the things I wanted to try to make a little bit of a distinction of here is that there are a number of two-factor, what they refer to as two-factor. I mean, the back channel communications method. This is a back channel communications, but there are a number of them that use texting as a back channel path with the sort of, I believe, the mindset that the texting goes to a device. But texting doesn't necessarily go to a device. It goes to an account, a texting account, of which is normally delivered to a device, but there may also be a web login that is based on a password that allows access to that same account and get the messages. Yep. And if you're an iCloud user or with an Apple messaging, iMessaging user, you know, or perhaps don't know, but you certainly can go and log into iCloud and get your text messages that way. And so it's important to really understand what the accesses are and things like this. If this is an app-based solution, it appears to be, where the app is effectively dedicated to being that back-channel communications and it's controlled in that manner, that's probably a much stronger solution than a lot of these other solutions that are essentially just sending it to an alternative, potentially compromised path.
And you've also got systems, I think iMessage actually lets you push it to multiple devices. So if you're trying to do some two-factor auth with your phone over here and your laptop is across the room and your kid is using it, he may see that. It's
most likely not the bad guy.
Most likely not the bad guy.
But it is certainly a possibility. And in some of these cases, if you have notifications that pop up, you don't even have to have, if you've lost your device and somebody takes that opportunity, they don't even have to necessarily have the pen to get into the device.
Oh, because it made you the little drop down and say, you've got a new message and here's its contents.
Yeah, so, be careful about how think through what those alternative paths are. And, one of I think, Matt, you and I were talking about it earlier, sometimes we forget our password, we just use the reset process.
Oh, yeah.
Almost always the reset process is basically based on access to your email account.
Yep.
And so really that's the one. And Brian Krebs made a big point about this in his book Spam Nation. Just kind of going with the theme of book reviews.
I read that one already.
He made a very strong point that you really have to have good security around your email account because a lot of things are predicated on access to that account.
Yeah. I remember the Matt Honan hack a while ago. We covered that on the show a couple years ago, and the whole idea was that they could escalate from one account to the next using email addresses and things like that, and eventually, completely wipe some devices. So it's part of that chain.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably list 10 notable attacks in the last year, usually against social media accounts and things like that, where it's been getting access to email accounts, resetting passwords, and going through that path. So, nevertheless, make sure you understand what the accesses are. I like the idea of a dedicated app for that back channel communications process so that you know exactly where if it's implemented correctly. Okay, so Matt, let's go back to you here, and we'll talk. I guess there's sort of a new theme around home security systems, trying to make homes not just make them secure, but more automation. But in that transition or the implementation of these things, we're going to have a few hiccups along the way. So is that a good place to give it to you?
The devil is definitely in the details here.
It is in the details.
Research came out from Rapid7. One of their researchers, Phil Bosco, took a look at the Comcast Xfinity home security system, which is an integrated security system that allows you to manage things, over Wi-Fi, over the internet, see how your home is doing. And it uses Zigbee wireless in order for you to, so they got a central unit and then sensors are over the house. And it works much like in any other alarm system where you have a central unit and then sensors. Older units, I guess, in the old days, you would have wires running to each one of these.
Right.
But here you have Zigbee.
Physically within the house.
Physically within the house. In theory, protected because there's nothing,
you have to get in the house to be able to.
Exactly. Thank you. That cleared it up a lot better than I could have. But now that you're using wireless, there's a whole different attack surface. And what Mr. Bosco found is that if you are able to interrupt the communications between a sensor and the main unit, typically what an alarm system should do is say, hey, one of my sensors just went missing, and throw a fit, trigger an alarm. Turns out that's not the case here. It fails open, which means that nothing occurs. So if you're able to prevent that communication, and in the test they used tinfoil to wrap around that sensor and prevent it from transmitting, when they would open that sensor open, it should say, hey, there's an alarm, someone actually opened the window, or whatever sensor it is. Nothing happened. So you wouldn't necessarily wrap somebody's window in tinfoil in order to trigger this in the real world. You would use a jammer, but that's the problem. You're able to disable a sensor simply by interrupting the communications path.
Yeah. Well, and this is 2.4 gigahertz, which is, older wireless phones, Wi-Fi.
Lots of things.
All kinds of devices. It's actually basically an uncontrolled spectrum. So the possibility of unintentional jamming is a possibility.
And that is one of the interesting things that keeps coming to my mind is, while someone could intentionally jam this and cause the system to fail, and you can use it as a way of breaking into a house, the possibility of it happening accidentally because of this interference, might be the reason it's configured this way. If in testing they found out that they've got, if your house is in a very saturated area where there's plenty of 2.4 gigahertz to go around, maybe they got tired of all the alarms that kept happening. So while that's one thing you can kind of say, I understand why they did it. On the other hand, in order for it to be a functioning alarm system, it has to alarm. The other problem that they discovered is not only can you knock it off very simply, apparently it takes a very long and variable amount of time for that sensor to reassociate. So they said up to 3 hours between knocking it off and finally getting that sensor back in. Now, they didn't say what the methodology was for determining whether it was associated or not. There's not too many technical details in the paper, but it's definitely an interesting read.
Yeah.
And I'd like to see more.
Yeah, I guess the other subtlety in this is Zigbee itself is a mesh network, so devices depend on other devices to communicate back to the home base. There may be relay nodes in there, so if you can knock out key nodes, it may cause others to at least be disrupted for a period of time, if not actually cut
I
off.
actually thought of it in the reverse way, that if you had more than one node, and because it's a mesh, there'd be a secondary path in
That's a
some
possibility.
cases.
Yeah, maybe it would self-heal. But I guess if it was far enough away from those outer nodes, then you might run into an issue.
I guess it's a give and take in that regard.
Yeah.
So at this
Depends on
point,
how it's laid out.
Yeah.
Right, sorry.
no, I was just saying, at this point, it sounds like they're going to have to patch and change the time delay between what's an acceptable amount of loss of a sensor. As somebody who likes to tinker, I think I would like to see a system that allows you to tune that for your own needs. If you happen to realize that you're in a place where it's going to cause problems, you can make that decision, hopefully. Maybe some people don't want to. Maybe some people just want to have a box slot into their house, some stuff in their windows, and they think, I'm good, I don't have to worry about it. But I think I'd like to play with those variables and see what's best for me.
Yeah, that's a good option. So one of the things I guess you pointed out is that the base station is UL listed.
That's what I've found. It seemed that on their site, they said that the base station itself is UL listed, which I think you were saying before, means that they've gone through a certain set of standards to check and say, this is the way an alarm system has to behave in order for it to be an alarm system.
Right, but it sounds that if it's in the context of the base station, it may only address that point from the base station back to the reporting platform, basically the monitoring platform or the monitoring service itself. And one of the significant aspects of this is that there must be a keep alive in place. That is, if the signal is lost, that's considered an alarm condition. And it's to deal with that old, the classic case, and we see in every movie is you go and cut the line before you go and burglarize a house or break into a system. And so the question is, and I haven't verified this, does that extend out to the sensors themselves, considering there's, as you pointed out earlier, this being a wireless system versus what we had presumed to be a protected wireline service in the traditional.
That's a good
solutions.
question, because even if you had individually UL approved sensors and individually UL approved central box, it's the entire system that has to be assessed.
Yep. So anyway, this is I think this is a good example of that sort of the growing pains, if you will, of IoT, where you have a lot of interconnected devices, in particular over wireless networks, and dealing with the intricacies, the details, the devil in the details associated with security. And I think that's one of the 10 or so commandments that we had identified in our collection of security commandments, is that you have to pay attention to detail in this business. All right, John, so let's go back to you.
Okay.
And so this difficult to block JavaScript ransomware. We've talked about some portable portable malware previously.
Right.
This is the first case I'm aware of where we have portable ransomware.
Yes, however, it's not really that they've actually seen real cases of this being cross-portable across various platforms, but I'll kind of give you the breakdown of it. So it's another family of ransomware. They're calling it Ransom32, and it's not really well detected. When they had done this report maybe a week or so ago, but today when I checked up on VirusTotal and some of the other AV vendors, it looks like there's a lot more uptake now that people are taking notice of this family of malware and detecting it. But it has some interesting aspects. A lot of things we've seen before, but in conjunction it makes it interesting. So if you go on the Tor network, you can go to a builder tool. that will allow you to build your own custom binary. So you go in, you fill out some forms, you put your Bitcoin address in there where you want to get the money for all the ransoms that you distribute, and they will send you a payload that's kind of tuned for your specific crimeware or ransomware campaign that you're running. So it's kind of a software as a service type model. Once you do that, it downloads a very large bundle. It's a 22 meg bundle, which is kind of different than a lot of malware we see, although we have seen some malware that is very large, but mostly we suspect that's because AV will leave that alone. So there's a lot of I don't think that's the case here, but I know there's some cases where there's been intentional malware that's in a really large file, because that will prevent AV from looking at it because it's just too big for it to want to scan through. And I don't know what that cutoff rate is, but I don't think 22 meg is it. The other interesting aspect of this one is it uses something called nw.js, which is, if you're familiar with Node, Node is kind of like a web server framework for making like server-side JavaScript as part of your application. So nw.js is basically, they've taken that code base and made it so that you can write desktop client-side applications in JavaScript, and it has the ability to access a lot of the core functionality of that platform too. So it's not protected like a sandbox. You can write to the registry and you can do all kinds of stuff through JavaScript, which is kind of interesting. It also has a Tor client built in, and that's what it uses to go back to the command and control. So that would be encoded or encrypted at least, so you wouldn't really be able to see it on the network, or you might have to look for Tor activity in order
trouble
to
tracing back where it's
pick it
going.
up. It could be, based on what they're looking at here, it could be really easily ported to Linux or Mac OS X because it's written in nw.js, but they actually haven't observed that they've done that. And there's some other little bit of components that they're actually using that are very Windows specific, like the Tor client is. They have a couple other VBS scripts that are running to do certain little functions that wouldn't run necessarily on all these other platforms, so they'd have to convert that. And then once it's installed, it starts encrypting lots of different files. So it's more than just like your normal Office files. They do like JPEGs and MPEGs and all kinds of, I don't even know why, but in any event, they're encrypting a lot of things with AES 128-bit encryption, and it's a different key per file, which makes it even more complicated, as we know. So just wanted to be on the lookout for. It kind of bugs me that, they've set up kind of a front door software as a service kind of thing to make it really easy for the script kiddies to go out there and say, oh, I want to start my own ransomware botnet here, and just go download the stuff without really having to do any legwork
We've
themselves.
seen some things kind of like this before, and particularly with this software, so this is a little confusing to say. Software as a service to build your malware, but is the command and control also a service?
I believe so. I think it goes back up there, and then you could log into the portal and see how many infected hosts have checked in, and how much money you've generated from it. I think they take a cut too. I'm not positive on that.
Well, that's a good possibility, but it regardless, from the builder provider's point of view, that is the folks that have created this tool, they're basically having others do their dirty work in terms of recruiting or compromising devices through this tool, and they probably have their.
If the back end is theirs, they're probably taking a cut of whatever the ransom is as
Well,
part
they
of
may
that
be
model.
taking a cut of the ransom, but they also have access to the machines that have been compromised to do whatever they want to do. So before the ransom is, and the encryption is done, they probably have an opportunity, at the very least, to steal whatever information is there, or do other things that might they might be motivated to do. So this is one of these things where it seems like a tool from the user's point of view. From their point of view, it's the folks that use their tool are the tool.
I'm kind of curious. If they say they're using an individual key for every single file, they encrypt.
Yeah, so it talks to the C2 to get it when it first starts up, I guess.
Wow, that's... Okay, I was just wondering, because anytime you talk about ransomware, the immediate question is how are they managing their keys? And are they being stored locally, and can somebody write a tool to get your files back?
Yeah, I didn't get in the details of actually how it gets, where those keys are stored and whatnot, but it did say a new key per file, so.
Wow. Yeah, so cloud-based botnet services. Lovely. Okay, well, thanks, John. And Jim, let's go to you again. And I guess you had made an observation, a note of, I guess a milestone at the end of 2015. Tell us a little more.
Yeah, I actually noticed this one on the Nanog mailing list over the weekend. They noted that IPv6 penetration had reached 10% on December 31st, 2015. Mm-hmm. That means from whatever their observation point was, IPv6 traffic made up 10% of the traffic on the internet as of the end of 2015. So that is a big milestone.
But when they say, is it really on the internet, or is it people accessing Google using IPv6?
Yeah, if I understand correctly, this information is from Google, and if I read it correctly, it's based on the number of visits to Google.
Okay.
So how many of those are based on IPv6 versus IPv4? And certainly, I think it's at the very least interesting how quickly is accelerating. That is the growth. It's not a linear growth. It's basically an accelerating curve toward IPv6. And I think the significance from a security standpoint here is that it's important that organizations pay attention. I think a lot of business enterprises are probably still IPv4 internally. Mm-hmm. I mean, why not? But in terms of offering services to the internet and providing protection services for that, protection from denial of service attacks, your analytical capabilities, those types of things, you really have to be paying more and more attention to the IPv6 aspect of it.
Exactly. December of 2015 was also the 20th anniversary of the release of the RFCs that defined IPv6. So it's taken 20 years to get here. But, we've been talking about this for a number of years now. Mm-hmm. People have been, the sky is falling. We're going to run out of IPv4 addresses, and there are no more blocks of IPv4 addresses to be handed out. So now they're getting reused. But mm-hmm. And now, we're seeing mobile devices that are getting native IPv6, and so with the proliferation of those, we need to be able to monitor IPv6 traffic. We need to, all of our tools that we've built up over the years for IPv4, we need to make sure we've got the same capabilities, because more and more of the traffic, as you said, internally within the enterprise, it may not move over to IPv6 quite as quickly. Mm-hmm. But what we're offering to the public, because of the lack of IPv4 addresses, we're going to see more and more IPv6. And I think John had noted on this chart here that it was back in probably in 2010 sometime that it crossed over from 6 to 4 and Teredo being the majority of the IPv6 problem traffic to native IPv6 being.
Yeah, and then it never looked back. It just kept going up, like you see on the chart here. Yeah,
it's a nice exponential curve there now.
Mm-hmm. I think another aspect of this that I found actually counterintuitive to me. I certainly didn't expect this, and I'm not sure exactly what the explanation is. But the other tab on this chart, this is just a capture from the website, but the other tab shows the distribution by country. I mean, not a detailed distribution, but basically shows that, and I was surprised to find that the United States had the greatest number of IPv6 users visiting Google, where I would have expected more IPv6 in other countries. My rationale, my thought process around this is that, when the address space was being divvied up originally, the IPv4 address space, it was a United States project at the time, and a lot of the address space got scooped up by U.S. entities, and consequently, as other countries were developing and growing their internet presence, they got all the leftover pieces, and so they were tending to run out of IPv4 address space more quickly. So it's not clear to me why, like I would have expected much denser in Asia than in the United States, but it turns out that it's sort of the other way around. So I don't have a clear explanation for that. Perhaps it's some sort of a bias in the data that was used to measure this, but you never know.
I would wonder if it has something to do with very specific client sets, like mobility clients or Internet of Things, or if there's a particular, maybe even a vendor that by default turns to IPv6 before 4, and I'd like to know. All this is just guessing and interesting theories, but
Nevertheless. Okay, so speaking of mobility, it's always interesting to talk about the next piece of mobile malware.
Yep. So this one is pretty clever. Symantec is calling it Spywaller, and basically it's spyware. It does all the things you'd expect mobile spyware to do: steal contacts, phone numbers, all the usual private information that's on a phone. The interesting thing that it does that's different is that it pretends to be a Google service, which most things, there's no such thing as Google service, but I guess in China, since they don't have access to the actual Google services set, maybe it's more likely that people will fall for that. I'm not sure. It's definitely Chinese targeted because not only does it have that, the main feature is that it uses DroidWall, which is a well-known Android firewall tool, to block connections to Qihoo 360, which is a Chinese antivirus company. So if this thing gets onto your phone, it'll prevent Qihoo 360 from updating or using any of its cloud services, whatever they happen to be. So it's interesting.
It is interesting.
That's an old trick, right? We used to see malware all the time update the etc host file on your machine or whatever, the host file in Windows, to say like McAfee's here and Symantec's here, just null route them to localhost or something.
So I believe that in order to run DroidWall, your phone has to be rooted. So again, this seems to be the case where people who are rooting their phones, and while I know there are definitely good reasons to do it, most users don't need to be doing this, and for them it tends to be more of an exposure to more malware than anything else.
Yeah. So generally speaking, our recommendation is don't root your device, or jailbreak it. Basically, it's not his term. But if you do, make sure you know what you're doing.
Absolutely, and only install stuff. No, don't install this.
Everybody thinks they know what they're doing.
Except
that's the problem.
We do.
Well,
right?
I don't know.
Oh, well,
maybe. But.
Yeah, this is until you find out that you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
The tendency is to think you know what you're doing. All right, well, this is something I know what we're doing here. So we're going to go take a look at the internet activity over the last week or so here. And I think generally speaking, there are no surprises here. We'll go through it and take a look at some of these a little more closely so you get some idea what's going on. First on the list is port 23 TCP, Telnet, that Internet of Things breaking into a lot of devices that expose Telnet and shouldn't be using Telnet at all. Followed by port 80 TCP. This is, obviously there's a lot of scanning. We usually see this a little farther down in the list. It's a little higher than usual. It's gone up 3 notches from last week. But when I took a look at it, it's really, I would call it a statistical anomaly. It doesn't look like there's any real significant activity or unusual activity associated with the scanning on port 80. Followed by port 22. We've seen cases where home router devices have a backdoor you can turn on port 22 and possibly have a default password associated with that, and that's been exploited. And then followed by 53.413. This is the Netis router backdoor. We can talk about that a little bit. I've got a graph to show the activity there. And then port 53 UDP. This one jumped up significantly, but it turned out that that's really sort of a spike in activity. This particular pie chart from yesterday, January 4th, by the way. And then followed by 1900 UDP. We're going to dig into that one a little bit more closely, followed by 445 TCP and 443 TCP. Last on here is 1911 TCP, which is associated with industrial control systems. I don't have a further graph of this, but this was actually research activity.
Right, yeah, some
not
researchers
necessarily
looking
associated with malicious actors, but certainly one to be paying attention to. That is, if you have industrial control systems, you want to be paying attention to that. So one of the things I haven't shown for a while, I thought I'd bring it up, is this notion of aggression factor. And this is really basically looking at the number of probes, that is we saw in the previous chart from the top 10, but also comparing that relative to the number of sources that are performing that probing. So it gives you some idea of how fast each one of the devices is actually doing its probing. One of the things you can basically ascertain from this is whether there's software that's being used to sort of perhaps subvert or shortcut the TCP
Right,
connection
like the mass
process,
scan
or
tools
how
and whatnot.
whether they're trying to hide or not, in general. And it's kind of interesting to see that the port 1911 TCP is actually these researchers have put some effort into making their scanning activity more aggressive, more efficient than a lot of these others. I don't think we've ever seen anything that has gone above about 8 in terms of the aggression factor. Most of the others look like they're just doing sort of a conventional make a connection, see if you get a response, then move on to the next, and possibly doing that in a multi-threaded fashion. We mentioned the scan probes on port 53 UDP. Again, this is DNS, and this spike here that we see that just had occurred actually yesterday, late in the day yesterday, is the cause behind that. I mean, obviously it's a spike in probing activity. I think it's associated with a reflective denial of service attack and there have been more attacks of those. We're going to take a little closer look at that later on. And then looking at the number of sources scanning on port 53 UDP, we see that there have been some spiky activities. Again, most of those spiky activities associated with sort of groups of reflective denial of service attacks that have taken place. Now, if we look at the last year of activity, this is actually looking at port 53 UDP as a source port. That gives us an idea. I mean, there's some legitimate DNS activity in there, but it gives us an idea of how much DNS is being used in reflective denial of service attack activity. As you can see, about halfway through the year last year, there was a transition where more attacks were using DNS, and you can see the reference lines here where we are showing the sort of the peak level of activity compared to what sort of a current average level of activity, and then comparing it with sort of the average level of activity that we were seeing in the first part of last year. So we're seeing definitely a more activity directing toward using DNS for reflective denial of service attacks. And then if we overlay that is the blue is showing the DNS here, the red is showing use of port 1900 UDP, that's Simple Service Discovery Protocol, which is really a local area network protocol. I think a lot of ISPs have started to sort of block that activity, and for the reason that it was being abused significantly for reflective denial of service attacks. As that blocking was being put into place, it was becoming less effective for the attackers, and so I think that's part of the motivation that they're moving toward using reflective DNS activities. In aggregate, the activity appears to have, we're seeing a little bit less of that reflective denial of service attack activity, but there's certainly an awful lot of it still in existence.
It certainly is nice to see scanning on a port like that go down, actually, for a change.
It's good to see it's going down. And technically this isn't scanning, but this is basically byte activity with the source port of that. Yeah. So it's the response side of these requests. Now looking at scan probes on port 23 TCP, well, basically there was a little bit of a break over the holidays between Christmas and New Year's, and it seems to have sort of revived itself. Actually, it goes back to even Thanksgiving, where the stuff was sort of trailing off. But just today, it looks like the activity has sort of started to revive itself, and so we can expect to see Telenet at the top of the list in the days going forward as well. We're looking at 60 days of activity in this graph, by the way. And then looking at the number of sources that are doing that scanning, there has been an increase today, not a significant increase in the number of sources, but there's a possibility that more recruiting will take place, and that number may go back back up in the next several days. And then looking at the scan probes on port 53413, this was again that Netis router backdoor. We're showing the URL for the link that describes this particular backdoor. As we'd observed and reported on a couple of times in December, this is activity where they basically spray out the script as a part of, basically in a packet, and if the device accepts it, it will basically execute that and then become part of the botnet as a part of this recruiting activities. Looking at these most sources doing the probing, well, we sort of covered this a little bit. Port 23 at the top, followed by 53413 UDP, port 445 TCP, and then we have a little bit of a move up on, actually move down for 27015 UDP. No real big deal in this one. This is not a lot of movement on this particular graph. So we'll move on. That's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack list.att.com. We certainly welcome your feedback, especially with the new year. In fact, why don't you share with us your New Year's resolution from a security standpoint especially. You can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube as well as on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. So I'd like to thank you, Matt. Thanks, John. Thank you, Jim. I'm Brian Rixrow. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.